Hi everybody, as promised, here's the next tutorial in a series of tutorials focused on going from SketchUp to Twinmotion for doing site work and landscape architecture. Okay, so this one I'm going to start very briefly in SketchUp just as a way of review from the last tutorial that I did, just as a little reminder. I'm also going to point out a couple things. We're back to this park site that I've been using, but the most of it I'm going to spend in Twinmotion talking about the materials, the library, the settings, and how you apply those once you've got your SketchUp model imported into Twinmotion, so you can really improve the quality of those textures. Okay, just as a little reminder for SketchUp, again, I had 4 points, I think. One, make sure all your textures are unique. And again, I will show you as I get into Twinmotion how we can actually change textures by object, even though, for example, this area, this area, this area, this area, and this area all have the same texture. But there is a setting where I can switch in Twinmotion from applying it to the material to applying it to the object. But again, that means I have to go through manually and pull that out. If I have separate, actually in this case, I'm not going to change it now, but if I put a different material here, 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 and here, I can always go in Twinmotion, apply the same ground cover material to them. But if I decided at some point I want to make them different, that having them unique gives me the option, so I don't have to go back and manually keep switching modes. I can just globally change one material. Okay, so it's not a deal breaker if you don't make all these unique. But for example, I cut in these planting beds so that now this is a different material from the background, from this foreground. And you'll see I did that so I could demonstrate some of the editing capabilities, but also in the next tutorial when we talk about plants, show you how you can use the plant scatter tool, and it responds to unique textures. So if you don't have unique textures, then if I hadn't recolored these two areas, I couldn't fill these with separate plant elements. I would have to fill the entire thing with the same one. Okay, I also went in and modified this a little bit. I added just some strips in here, some accent paving strips of a different material, so you can see how that can work. That was set, looks pretty good actually in terms of being a projected material, and that's the second point I want to remind you of. Generally, you want to keep materials as projected materials, and that just means that you've thought through in SketchUp the scale that you want. Again, I did that by zooming out here and applying the material to a planar surface. And once I'm in that planar surface, I can go to texture and position, and I can rescale that to whatever size I want, rotate it, get it oriented the way I want, and then right click and convert it to a projected texture. Once I have that, I can apply that to a landform. Again, remember, if I turn my hidden geometry on, this is a mesh with lots of complexity, and you can see the difference. Otherwise, if you don't have it as projected, it will apply the texture to each one of these triangles differently, and the orientation changes. If it's projected, it's just uniform across the whole surface, whether the hidden lines are showing or not. So that's important, and I think it's also important because this material selection, and I know the students I've been helping, they're at the stage where they have to think about materiality, and scale is important, orientation is important, whether it's modular, whether it isn't, how it's placed within the shapes that you've created and how it affects those shapes and how the shapes affect the placement of the material. So the whole point of this is that materials are design, and you need to think through that. And the more you've thought through that in SketchUp and differentiated between one material and another, the better. Because once you get into Twinmotion, it's easy to start globally changing materials, dropping plants in, and covering up lots of things that you really haven't thought through that you should as a designer. So I'm just encouraging you to really think through each texture that you apply here, and then make sure that it's responding to your design idea the way it should. And then when you're in Twinmotion, you may see something that will cause you to change it, and there are several options that allow you to do that. But at least you've thought through it at this stage while you're actually working on the geometry of your design. And the third one, front and back faces. Generally I try and keep the front faces oriented out or up, front, and the back is back. And usually I just put the material on the front face and leave the back in the neutral face. I have seen some issues with having different materials on different sides, and at certain situations they kind of cause a flicker effect that I mentioned last time. So usually I try to keep either the same texture all the way through, like you see here, or neutral texture on the back and the texture that you want on the front. Again, that doesn't always cause problems, but that's kind of a consistency in modeling in SketchUp that you want to think about. And then finally, avoid those overlapping faces, not just front and back differences, but the fact that you don't want two planar surfaces that don't have thickness to occupy the same plane and space, or that will create problems, particularly if they have different materials applied to them. So just think about your modeling, be careful, and be consistent with how you apply those things. Okay, so that's just, I just want to remind you of those things. Also want to point out one other aspect. One of the things I did here, I added to this model at some point is this, this is a mound that I sculpted freehand using the artisan tools. And then later I went back in and actually painted on that pathway. I sculpted in, started with just a uniform mound, and then I sculpted in this spiral walkway. If I turn on the hidden geometry, again, it shows the power of subdivision modeling. I went in and I subdivided this area around the path so I could grade it more finely where I don't really need it that fine down here or up on top. And then even without the hidden geometry on, Artisan also has a paintbrush tool. So I just went in and painted this pathway, and you can see it's not perfect because it's following the triangulations. And if I broke it down even farther at the edges, I could get it smoother. But for something like this, if you're going to have grasses and plants adjacent to it, you won't really see the edge. And so that saved me the trouble of having to draw this two-dimensionally and drape it onto the landform and split this and everything else. And I could actually go in and just kind of freeform it if I wanted to expand the pathway at a certain point or move it back. So that's another technique, and this will come through fine into Twinmotion, and you'll be able to change that material separately if you want to as well. So I think that's one of the things I wanted to point out, just to say that's another option to apply materials in SketchUp. Okay, let's make sure this is saved properly, since I've been making some changes on it. And then what I want to do now is just spend a little bit of time talking about the materials that we're going to be working with. And I know at this point in the semester, we don't have time to go through a real intellectual study of what's going on here, but you should at least be aware of some of these kind of the reasoning behind this. And I think Twinmotion folks actually have this kind of outline, and I'll provide a link to it on YouTube and in Canvas. And what we're doing is creating PBR materials, and that stands for physically based rendering materials. And they're a little different than what SketchUp uses. SketchUp just uses a photographic image, and they take a picture of brick that has the right lighting on it to make it look kind of three-dimensional, and that's the extent of it. Physically based rendered materials actually use the rendering engine in Twinmotion, uses physics and lighting to change the way the materials look. They actually respond to weather, to time of day, to season. So it's important to understand that that's the way that rendering engine is set up, and that's really kind of the future of rendering. Most programs are going with PBR materials. And this is important because when you go into Twinmotion and you start editing materials, there's a lot of different settings, and they all relate to the fact of how this PBR material works. So I'm just going to run through this quick, and I'll provide a link to this later, but I want to pull out the types of image maps that we're going to be using. First of all, it mentions the PNG as the optimized format for Twinmotion. So we'll talk later about making your own custom textures, and I've got a few places up here we'll look at sources that you can find them online. They aren't all in PNG. Some of them are in JPEG. Some of them are in Targa. And so you need to be aware that the PNG is what you really want. If you find a great texture and it's in the wrong format, open it in Photoshop and save it back out in the other form. Secondly, we're working in multiples of 2. So we've got 512 by 512, 1024 by 24, or 2048 by 2048. This is 1K. This is 2K. Mentions Twinmotion's materials are all in a 2K resolution, so that's the highest you want to go. You can online you can find 4K and 8K, but for a real-time rendering engine like Unreal Engine and Twinmotion, that's just going to slow things down. So look for 1024 by 1024, and again, use your good judgment. If you're applying materials that are on background elements, maybe you only need 512 by 512. Because you're not going to see any of the detail. But if you're right up close to something in your views, then you probably want to go with the 2K resolution because that's what you'll get with the materials that are built into Twinmotion. As always, use seamless textures, not just a photograph that's kind of been, flattened out or something. It has to be a seamless tiling texture. It mentions this AO map, that stands for ambient occlusion. That's one of the image maps that Twinmotion doesn't support, but you can blend that in Photoshop with your albedo, which is the same as this diffuse map that we're going to talk about in a minute. That's not necessary, so maybe at another time I can do a tutorial that's more about how to create these materials from scratch. For right now, I just want you to be aware of the types of maps that Twinmotion uses so that as you go in and change them, you'll know what they do. So the first is this diffuse map, and as it says, it's the most basic. It defines the surface main color and pattern. Now, this isn't really a photograph. It can be photographic, but you'll notice that it tends to be lighter than what we think of. It's kind of toned down because we don't want really strong contrast in this, because that contrast comes from the lighting conditions. If you would take a picture of a brick wall outside, that's what would create that. And at different times of day, it looks completely different, whether it's a sunrise or sunset or midday. So the idea is to have a diffuse map that has a relatively low contrast that provides the color and the texture. And then also in Twinmotion and a lot of programs, these diffuse maps can contain an alpha channel. And that defines what part of that is transparent. So if you scroll down here, like if we have a mesh image, but it has an alpha channel, when you apply that opacity mask, if you turn that on, now you can create this see-through mesh without actually having to cut holes in the geometry. So that can be super useful if you're doing fences that you want to be able to see through, or you want plants growing up or whatever. That gives you you don't have to model that geometrically. You just simply find a texture map that has an opacity mask on it, an alpha channel, and you apply that in Twinmotion. It also works for decals. That alpha channel allows you to put a decal, say the Twinmotion logo, on a surface without affecting the underlying base material. And you can build your own, or you can just swap out an image on one of Twinmotion's built-in patterns. But again, PNG supports transparency masks or alpha channels, so that's another reason. JPEGs do not. So if you want transparency, you need to use a PNG file. A normal map is what sometimes referred to as a bump map, and it's a purple-blue texture, as you can see down here, and it tells the renderer what surfaces are coming up and what surfaces are going down. It's kind of interesting that in this case, it kind of looks like the joints are coming out here, and they're, instead of being recessed, when in fact when it's applied, the joints look recessed. That's just the way it uses that map. I'll mention now there's also two formats for normal maps. One is DirectX and one is OpenGL. Twinmotion uses a DirectX. Basically, they have the RGB channels. The green channel is flipped, it's inverted, so that if you download a set of image maps that includes a normal map that's in the OpenGL format, what you expect it to be going down is going to be going up, and vice versa. Now you can actually fix that in Photoshop by just going to the channel tab and inverting the green channel. But the best thing is to look for most sites where you can find these. They'll tell you whether it's a DirectX or OpenGL version, but it is possible to fix it in Photoshop if you get one that's not the way you want it. And even in Twinmotion, it's referred to as a bump map. So it's the bump setting, which we'll look at in a second. Roughness map it's kind of funny. It's controlled in the reflection properties in Twinmotion. So basically, if it's not rough, it's very reflective. If it's rough, then there's more diffuse or reflection or scattering that's happening on the surface. And the way these sliders generally work, like it says here, the reflection slider is set to 50%. We use the exact roughness, the texture you've loaded. If you increase the slider, it will blend it with white, making it rougher. And if you decrease it, it blends it with black, making it smoother. So the 50% setting doesn't mean it's half strength. It means that's normal. And then you can adjust the intensity of that effect by sliding those sliders up or down. And a lot of times that's just making a visual judgment on the screen as to what you want that material to look like. And ultimately, this is kind of important. If you understand the physics behind this, then as you're designing a place or a space or a building, you need to be aware some tiles are reflective and are more glossy, some tiles are rougher and they don't have reflection, and that also obviously affects how water runs off of it. It affects how safe it is to walk on. It affects the ambient lighting in an area because it's reflecting more light, which is bouncing off of more things. So those are important design aspects that when you choose a brick paver or a tile, you need to understand what those qualities are in the actual material, and then you need to represent them appropriately in Twinmotion. It also has another map. It's called the metallic map, and Twinmotion actually used the metallic process. There's a couple different approaches to dealing with PBR materials, and one of them is metallic, and that's the one Twinmotion uses. So it has this metallic setting. It's a slightly different set of maps. And this is, again, most of these are just grayscale textures, and white represents fully metallic and black represents non-metallic. And then you can adjust the slider again. So here's an example. There's a metal piece of trim here, and here it doesn't have much reflection, but when you set it up, now it's shiny and looks like a piece of polished aluminum or steel inset to these wood panels. And I think lastly, we have a glow map. You don't really use this one very much. What this does would allow you, in this example, to apply this to a material that represents the surface of a light and with the bezel around it. And then if you turn that map says, okay, there's these three little lights, maybe LED lights inside that bezel, and you can set that up so that they actually glow. Now it's not really a light source, it just makes them visible at night. So if you wanted to show these glowing at night and also show the light, you can see here there's no light going up the wall here. You'd have to place a Twinmotion light there, spotlight pointing up to get the real lighting effect. But the thing about Twinmotion lights is you don't actually see the light itself. It's a light source, but so it would be like having a street light shining down with a Twinmotion light, and you can see the light coming out, but the light itself isn't glowing, and that doesn't look right. So that's where you would use this. You would either give the whole light surface or use a map to give a part of that surface a glowing effect, so it looks like the light is actually on. Okay, there's also for that glow, there's a day and night setting. So if you set that on, the lights automatically start glowing. Those areas start glowing at night, but during the day they don't glow because it's too bright. And then finally, you can save any material that you create or one that you've modified in Twinmotion. You can save that off as a new material and add it to a user library so that the next time you do a new model, that will be accessible. Otherwise, if you don't, it will have effect within the model that you're working on, but when you close that, it won't be available to you for additional use. And that's just click on the three dots here and choose Add to User Library. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. That's kind of the basics of those things, and maybe I'll just go ahead and load in our file. Again, I'm going to pick the park, and remember from last time, we're going to collapse it by material because that way we have access to all those materials that we can modify and bring that in. Now what I'm going to do next is once this imports, I'm going to run through, show you where the library is, look at the categories real quick, and then I'll go through the process of applying a couple textures and show you the basic settings for all those different types of maps that we just talked about. And again, that's one of the reasons why you see here, I mentioned last time, these SketchUp materials look a little bright because they don't have any information in them that helps Twinmotion understand how they should be lit by the sun and how that affects their appearance. So before we get started with some actual materials, let's go over here to the left. And if I go up to the very top, I've got the first folder that's here is materials that are a very important aspect of working in Twinmotion. So I'm just going to click on that, and you can see I've got glass, metal, concrete, wood, stones, brick, ground, plastic, pretty extensive list of different types of fabric, neons, which have that glow factor already turned on. You can actually add a video clip in as a material, which is kind of cool. So if you want something playing on a screen, one of the things I really hope they add in, the only issue with videos is that the sound doesn't play. I thought about this as a really cool way to present your design. You could have basically a kiosk at different places within your design. You could record a video that explains what's going on there, and also you can set these so that they have a certain radius of sound. So if someone moves through the space and they get close to a kiosk, you would be able to hear what that video is saying. And unfortunately, at this point, the only thing you get is the video part. You don't get any audio. They're kind of limited in what kind of audio you can bring in. Well, actually, it's just, I mean, what you can use. You can use their built-in sounds, and that's about it. You can't bring any audio in that's custom made from somewhere else. But I'm hoping in the future that will be a kind of cool option. And we have water and translucent materials. So let's just pick something that's, let's pick a concrete color. I've got all this paving down here, and I can see if you hover over it, it gives you a little preview. And if I wanted something, say maybe I'm going to take this exposed aggregate material. And the first thing you need to do is click and just drag it over top of a material here. Now, that doesn't look too good in there. And actually, it's kind of surprising because I've done this before. But let's see if we can figure out what's going on. I'm not sure why that's changed, but this gives us a chance to go through the settings. That's why. So I had been playing around with this and changing this before. These icons up here, there's always a few icons here available. The first one is the one that tells us to apply it to object or replace material. Since this is one big object, I'm going to leave it on object. And then the next thing I want to do is right here, I'm going to say from object UV. Now, one of the things that took me a while to figure this out, when you switch it, nothing happens. So what you need to do is reapply that material to there. Okay, let's try cubic UV then. There we go. I think if I would have had that set on object UV when it was imported, I know that for a fact, that if it was set on object UV, it would have come in looking exactly like this, because that's the one I already applied a projected texture to. But because I had it set on spherical, you have to kind of keep going back and resetting it to get it to take it. So now we've got their concrete material, and you can see it's a lot less bright and glaring. This is an exposed aggregate. So let's just take this one and go through the anatomy of a texture and see what we can do. So you saw this pop up briefly. There's kind of all these menus or these options have a main setting, and then a lot of them have more down below here. So if I click on the main one here, I get this color bar. Now I can come in here and adjust the brightness just by moving this up and down. I could also give it a tint if I wanted to. And this is the most effective with lighter materials. If you have darker materials, you're not going to get as much of a tint naturally, because it just doesn't have much of the white area to pick up the tint. But that's just gives you an option to change the color and the value qualities of that material. What makes this look like it does, you can see that's got the exposed aggregate, is found under the More tab. So several different things. The first one is the texture. If I click on that, you can see this is a concrete exposed aggregate texture. And that's actually an image that's brought in and applied to this PBR material, and it uses that. That's the diffuse map, basically. It says texture, but that's the diffuse map we were just talking about. If you wanted to put another one in here, you can click open and navigate to wherever you find a texture and replace it with something else, which I won't do for right now. But the opacity mask we talked about is if you had an alpha channel on a concrete flooring, you're not going to have an alpha channel. Luminosity is kind of how bright or dark it is in terms of its light reflectance. Grunge is an interesting setting. It allows you to kind of give a weathering effect. You can see, kind of wish it had a little finer control over the scale of the grunge, but again, no surface out there in the real world is perfectly even. So maybe I set my luminosity up a little bit too, add the grunge, and then pull that grunge down a little bit farther. It just creates some kind of random variation that you would get from staining and from weathering and things like that, and irregularities in the way it was put down in the first place. And then we've got sound. Probably will set this to concrete. So if you're using the walk mode that I mentioned last time, when you walk across this, it'll sound like you're walking on concrete. So those are all things under that first color tab. Reflection is where we would have this roughness map. And again, if I click more, there's a texture there, and it's basically using the same one to create the roughness. And so I changed that pattern by clicking on more, but I changed how smooth or rough it is by adjusting this bar here. And again, I would use that and zoom in and make a visual judgment. Does it look the way you want? Scale, I can make this really big and giant exposed aggregate, or I can scale it down. So again, be careful with that and make sure you zoom in to be able to see whether it's appropriate or not. The weather setting just means if this is on, let's see, let's go to weather. Okay, so you can see it's pouring down rain now, and it's puddling, and it has the effects of the raindrops hitting and all that. But if I go back to my materials, turn weather off, now you can see the rain's coming down, but nothing's being affected by it. So anything, there may be some objects you don't want to have affected, but certainly the ground plane is one that you do to make sure that it looks natural when it's raining or snowing. Let's get rid of the rain. It's cloudy enough here. Okay, there we go. So let me pick that up again. And then there's a kind of a catch-all settings. This is where we find the bump map. We get that normal map. So again, in here, if I click on this, this is just a generic texture that's built in. So if you make your own material, you'd have a custom purple-blue kind of normal map that you would use for that setting. Here's our metallicness setting. And again, the more gives you option to put in an image map for that setting. Glow you don't really want to use unless it's you're making a plastic light covering glow or something like that. Or you have a glow map like we were just looking at in this case, and here's the day cycle setting. And to get, again, to back up, you just come over here left, go back to settings. Two-sided, generally I haven't had to use this. The only time you might use that is the kind of chain link example that I showed you. If you apply that to a surface that was like a sphere or a cylinder, in SketchUp, since it's only got one surface, has the pattern on it, you would see it on the front when you're looking at it, but when you look through it, you wouldn't see the back side of the sphere or the cylinder. So if you turn this on, it would allow that that image to be, or the texture to be applied all the way around that front and back. Normally, you don't really need to have that. X-ray, I'm not going to talk about right now. That gives you a way to have materials that become, if you wanted to show utilities or pipes under the ground, but I don't think at this point we're really dealing with that, but you can play around with that if you want. Okay, so I think that's where I've found all the settings, and so there's under the glow, the metallicness, the bump, those are all places you can put those different image maps in to control it. You could also pick just a plain color, and over here, if you want to know how to use this setting, if I click on multi, I could come in here and click plus. It will add a new material. I'll select that and go back to single. And now I could come in and just say, well, if I want a bright material, I want it to be reflective, I want it to have kind of high metallicness. If I wanted a bump map on it, let's see if I could find a bump map here. PBR textures. Some paving stone texture. So here's what a normal map looks like. I'm just going to open that, and nothing happened, right? That's because this is set at 0. So if I turn this up, you can see it's actually applying that bump map to that smooth material. So it looks like it's been embossed or something with that material. I turn it up all the way. You can see what that's going to look like. So that's how you can kind of mix and match and make your own materials that way. But you just need to click on this, make a new material with the plus, choose it, go back to this, and then, if I wanted to apply that, I just drag that out and drop it on that wall. Doesn't really work particularly well there, but you get the idea. That's anything that's that material or that object, depending on what the setting is here. Right now it's still on apply to object, is going to pick up that material. Just going to undo that for right now. Okay, so those are, and the opacity map, if you I didn't bring an example of this in, but you know, here these were actually created with geometry in SketchUp. You know, modeled. Somebody did this. I didn't make it. But if you wanted to create this effect, you could use a map that has this pattern on it, an image pattern with an alpha channel, and it would just cut the holes in there for you, so you don't, and the light will show through there and everything else. So let's pick this, maybe this sculpture up here is supposed to be kind of metallic. Or if I want, let's see if I can pick this up. So one way to start changing these materials is to use your material picker. Come out here and you can see it picks up the ground cover and it's pretty flat. So I'm going to come up here to, let's do stones and man-made. And I'm going to scroll through here. You can see there's more cobblestones. It's not bad looking there. Maybe, no, let's just go back to this. So I can drag that and drop that on there, and you can see that it just changed that to that texture, which has a lot more bump and relief to it. It looks more 3D. Now it's a little coarse, right? So I can come down here in the scale and zoom this down. I can also click on more, and I can rotate it around. And in this case, it's not mapped like those curved walkways to follow it around. But one thing that would give you to, if you were taking a view from here and you wanted it to look like it's going this way, you could set up your view and just come in here and rotate it around so it looks right in that particular view. And then you can pull the rendering off, and if it looks a little different from another place, or you can maybe go in and do it on a diagonal, right? So it doesn't matter which direction it's from, it kind of looks the same. And you can also come in here and shift it back and forth on the X and the Y. Or you can also stretch it. So if you want to distort it a little bit or stretch it on one axis or another, you can do that as well. So hopefully you're getting the idea of how this, and let's maybe go to color, drop the luminosity, set the grunge up a little bit, and now it starts looking a little more like a rough stone pathway. Kind of distorted the bump out of it, but let's pick up this one and go up to our nature, and maybe I'll pick this last grass, drop it on there. Again, you can see how that's mapping it on there, and again we can adjust the scale if we want to pull that down, and now it looks, it's not quite so bright and radiant, and you can see in this case it's applied that to all those surfaces. See them all as they're all one object anyway. So now if you want to go in, I think this does have another material on it. I think this is applied maybe to that as well. But if I wanted to apply a different material to that, I can again come in here, make this sure it says apply to object, go back up. Oops, sorry. It's easy to click on that. Go to concrete, soft concrete, and just drag it and drop it on there. Now it looks a little different than the exposed aggregate, and I've got kind of the look that I want there. Okay, so either select it and drag it onto the material that's showing up in the preview here, or just drag it out and drop it right on the same material. Just be aware of the apply to object or replace material. Replace material replaces it globally, everywhere it's found. So you'll find out if you have a piece of material that has the same texture somewhere else that you don't want to change, it will change everything if you do it that way. Let's go back up to this metal. Let's find a slightly worn chrome. Yeah, you don't want to put that in the building. So now I've got my chrome metallic structure. You can see that this one here already has some kind of transparency set on it that came through from SketchUp, because I'm getting this kind of purplish blue shadow from the light actually casting through that. So you have lots of adjustments. You can affect that bump. You can affect the opacity mask, the grunge. I guess some of these materials I wouldn't want to apply that grunge to, but and I think if you want to start with translucent materials like these, blue foam, you can apply that to that and adjust them Now in that case, it's interesting, this doesn't have perfectly consistency. So there really normally isn't a translucency setting, but there's one of these, obviously these materials here. So if I had that set at, let's undo that. Let me just take that one, apply it to that. Now you can see the color of that changed, but I can come in here and adjust the translucency. So now it's not quite as translucent. I'm getting a little shadow underneath there. Still getting some of the color coming through. Click on my color. Some things I really don't, I wish they had some control over this. Usually I keep when I'm working on centering the screen, and this always pops up exactly over top of it. So I can drop that down if I want it a little darker. Move it a little more toward the pure blue hue. Now we're kind of back to pretty much what we had before, but now we have the control of the Twinmotion pattern on it. Okay, so that's kind of the run through of how to use the materials. And I'll show you in the next video how to use these materials to also apply plants in particular areas. I'm not going to go through the process in this one right now of making a custom material. I can do that in a separate video for anybody who wants to do it. But I can tell you there are lots of sources for those out there. If I jump back over here, and one of them's called this CCO textures. These are all free materials. So if I go browse all assets, you can see there's some really interesting materials. On a pretzel roll, we got that. If you pick one of these, click on it, you can see that it gives you the options to download as 2K, 4K, 8K. Again, we don't want to go beyond 2K. And if you click on the little play button here, it will actually load a navigable 3D model. So you can see what that, there's kind of a grass-crete concrete pavers with allows you to grow things in between. And when you download this, this will include, I don't know if it says here anywhere, but this zip file includes, actually, I can go to PBR textures, here's the paving stones. It includes ambient occlusion, color, which you don't really need to use in Twinmotion. Here's the color map. You can see this is normally what we would think of when we apply a pattern in SketchUp. It looks like, you know, it's a little darker. And these actually are, this is color and AO combined. So that's combining the ambient occlusion. And that's what you can do in Photoshop. As a matter of fact, if you combine this with this, this is what you get. This is the displacement JPEG. Again, displacement is like the bump map, the normal map, only the normal map makes a pattern look like it's raised or lowered in the plane of the surface. But if you look at the edges, say you had a brick wall, if you look at the corner of the brick wall, it's going to be perfectly sharp. Displacement actually changes the geometry, and so you would see those bricks sticking out and the joints sticking in, the rake joints sticking in at the corner. Lumion supports this. They've got some new patterns that in version 10 that like you can make sand actually have physical ripples so that you can see them. Not just kind of the illusion that those ripples are there. You can actually see them around an edge. That's something Twinmotion doesn't support yet. I'm sure it will eventually. So if you're downloading these, get the displacement file because maybe the next version or the next one's going to support that. I know Unreal Engine does. So get those while you're downloading the whole package. There's the normal map. And again, it's the right kind of normal map because you can still, the joints look like they're sticking up, not down. But this is an example where you could use these, but what you really want to do is download these, open them in Photoshop, save them out with the same names or whatever names so you can tell what they are as PNG files, and then they're going to work a lot better for you. Okay, so this is one. It's a good one. Textures.com. This one, it has some free materials. I mean, you can see this is pretty amazing. It's showing the different maps that it uses. That was created by something called Substance. I forget the Substance Creator, Substance Designer. It's just an amazing piece of software that allows you to create any textures you want, and then it generates all the maps that you need. And I think as a student, you can get it for free, or a faculty member. Otherwise, you have to pay. So these are patterns that somebody created using that, and they're selling them for credits. I'm pretty sure this Textures.com, it was formerly GT Textures. They still have a bunch that are free, but they also have a lot that are paid, but if you have a material that you really like and it's something you really want, then it may be worth buying a few credits and downloading it. Polygon is another one. These are for sale, but if you do a search for free Polygon with 2 I's instead of a Y, you can find them. You have to set up an account, but it doesn't cost anything. And they give you the options to 1K, 2K, 3K, 4K. So you have to select, and they give you the option to choose which image maps you want to download. This is Substance Designer web page. It's by Adobe. It's pretty amazing. It can do just amazing stuff. You can see it creates all these maps. If you're a Grasshopper user, this you see is familiar. It's a graph way of procedural way of designing these, so you can go in and change the variables and change how this looks and randomize it. It's quite powerful. Quickcyl is one that actually Unreal Engine bought, and it has similar, as you can see here, we're joining forces with Epic Games. So a lot of Quickcyl images are going to be very useful. They mentioned another one called Crazy Bump. This one is, I don't know what it costs, but it's apparently all the cool kids are using it, and it's pretty funny. They have a good sense of humor, but it generates just from a photograph all these different maps, and then shows you what they do when they're mapped onto the surface. So it can generate all those different ones too, and it looks pretty amazing. I don't know what it costs, but I'll check it out and let you know. And then finally, another one that Substance has is this. It's called Bitmap to Material, and I like this one because you don't really have to know that much about it. Oh, here it is. Essentially, you drop an image map onto here, and it creates. Then you just have we have a bunch of controls for relief, diffuse, base color. It goes through and takes that original image and creates all these different images out of it, so you can see what that looks like on a three-dimensional object. Really simple to use. So if you have some photograph or bitmap, it can take, if it has too much contrast, it'll take the contrast out of it and give you the right diffuse map, add all these other features to it. So this is just a short list. There's lots of them out there that you can use, but if you really want to get into your own custom materials, as you can see here, this is an image that you really wouldn't want to use but by itself, but when it goes through and works through these different processes, it gives you a much more realistic material that actually, it's not just that it looks better, it responds to the changing light conditions and weather and everything else. So if it's cloudy, it looks different than if it's sunny. If it's in the morning, it looks different than if it's midday. So when you have time, spend a little time looking into PBR Materials. They're the things that's going to make your Twinmotion model super realistic, and it's really, as a designer, you should be thinking about what those materials really look like. How do they change during lighting conditions? It's the problem with just doing photo collages in Photoshop. You don't have any idea what that actually is going to look like in the real world on a rainy day, or on a sunny day in the middle of summer, or a sunny day in the fall, because you're using generic images that have nothing to do with the real world physics of the atmosphere. So that's another reason things like Twinmotion and Lumion are so powerful. It really makes you a better designer because you can understand the materials that you're working with that make up your design. So hopefully that was helpful. Stay tuned. Tomorrow I'll work on the next tutorial that's going to focus on placing plants into Twinmotion. Thank you.